Kyle McNulty, and you're listening to Secure Ventures, the show that follows cutting-edge founders in the cybersecurity space to understand their plights, glories, and revolutionary products. This episode is a re-release of a conversation recorded with Yuri in January 2022. With the rise of AI-driven fraud, there's been fitting attention on the evolution of fraud detection and prevention capabilities. This episode is one of my all-time favorites because Yuri takes us through the evolution of fraud prevention as attackers and defenders exchanged blows and innovation, a battle which persists today with the new technology available. His most recent company that was in stealth at the time of the episode, Refine Intelligence, has since emerged and raised $13 million in seed funding in November of last year. This episode is brought to you by Vulncheck. Vulncheck helps teams defend against weaponized exploits by delivering the most comprehensive vulnerability and exploit intelligence in the market today. Vulncheck gives enterprise and federal teams better, faster data so they can autonomously prevent exploits and reduce risk and outpace adversaries. So what's different about Vulncheck? The company delivers its solutions to teams in machine-readable and consumable formats for a truly autonomous approach to vulnerability prioritization and exploit mitigation. Vulncheck has close to 300 million unique data points, which is 5 times the exploits of ExploitDB, and 200 plus CVEs packaged into complete detection artifacts for proactive teams. Vulncheck provides a full suite of solutions to enable teams with rapid adoption of Vulncheck data, including its community tier of offerings and its enterprise-class solutions, exploit and vulnerability intelligence, and initial access intelligence. With Vulncheck, teams can proactively defend against remote execution events, enrich every data source, and continuously outpace adversaries. If you're interested in learning more about Vulncheck and checking out the free community edition where you can play with their database of known exploited vulnerabilities, please click the link in the show description so they know you came from the podcast. Yuri, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Kyle. Happy to be on the show.
Now, just about your entire career has been focused on identity. And we'll talk more about what some of those different projects are and how your impact in identity has continued to evolve. But what is it that's so fascinating about identity to you in the first place?
The fascinating thing about identity is that it's stolen left and right, okay? Essentially, it's this notion that fraud is an ever-changing landscape. It's part of a bigger sort of theme called financial crime. But at the end of the day, if we think about the digital world, we talk about online fraud. You know, people can steal your identity when they open a new account. People can break into your online banking account with all sorts of very clever combinations of social engineering, technical tools. So I would say that it's a very, very fascinating landscape because it's so dynamic. The criminals adapt to the defenses that, let's say, the banks are developing, and then the banks have to adapt to that. So you always have to be thinking about, what's next? How do we defend people against the next attacks? How do we respond fast to things that are happening? And I can tell that in 20 years, things have dramatically changed. So that's definitely a very, very exciting market.
So everything you just touched on kind of focuses in on the financial crime component of identity. But as we think about identity today in the cybersecurity ecosystem, identity really plays into every aspect of security, right? So every tool component has an identity piece to it. Every application, even cloud environments, for example, they all have identity aspects related to them. What is it about the financial crime component that really drew you in?
I would say just the fact that it's so dynamic. It started with phishing. I was a part of a company that was acquired by RSA. The name of that company is Sayota, which in the early days of, let's say, 2003, 2004, was trying to combat e-commerce fraud, later on retail banking fraud, and things kept changing all the time. New types of attacks, phishing attacks, Trojan attacks, social engineering attacks. Criminals are so effective in doing this, and it's like so adaptive in nature. And that's what kind of drew me into focusing within the broad identity theme on, crime, right? On how do you defeat those criminals? Now, the financial motivated cyber criminals, they're well funded. They're always going after the end users of their targets, right? They're not interested in just broad data and things like that. And they always get away with it at the end of the day, right? So they are extremely clever. They have like a whole sort of ecosystem, and it's just fascinating.
So I want to touch on that a little bit more. In some industries, there's this whole idea of assumption of breach and kind of the expectation that we're never going to be able to keep pace with the bad guys just because of the resources that exist over there compared to limitations by the good guys. What do you think how do you think the scale balances for financial crime? Is that sort of a similar mentality where everyone recognizes that these bad guys are going to get away with some attacks and we just have to limit which ones they can actually successfully pull off? Or is there a belief that really all of these attacks can be stopped with the right technology?
Absolutely no. So it's not that technology can stop all of these attacks and prevent crime and things like that, because the criminals are adaptive. I'll give you a small example from the last two years. Just think about the Corona crisis, right? The global virus outbreak. Fraudsters, let's say in the US, are making today much more money hitting the government, let's say the state level government, than they are hitting the banks. What they did was shift their strategy and understand that all they have to do, you talked about identity, all they have to do is steal the identity of, let's say, taxpayers, go to all of these state level agencies, file, let's say, an unemployment claim or something like that, and then move the money to an account that they control. Now, these accounts, they open on other people's name. So you almost have like a double crime here. The first crime is to open an account on behalf of someone else. This is known as account opening fraud. You can do, identity theft, like just take someone who is like really Kyle and using information that you know about Kyle, just open a bank account, let's say. Or you can do a completely synthetic identity. We can talk about synthetic identity if that's interesting, but it's a made-up identity that you somehow put into the financial system. So this is like the preparation. After that, you go and hit the government. You again pose as a real person and say, hey, I need you guys to move me some money to that bank account. It's very, very effective. And they're very, very dynamic about it, and they're making a lot of money.
So when you were at Scioto, which aspect of this kind of double crime, as you put it, were you trying to solve? Were you trying to protect that individual's identity from being stolen in the first place, or protect those subsequent groups, such as those government agencies that are creating new accounts for stolen identities?
So that was more focused on the banking side, and it was focused on what we call account takeover. So think about phishing attacks, right? And in the early stages of phishing, let's say 15 years ago, something like that, 17 years ago, banks didn't really know how to handle this because their IT security was very, very tight. But then, you just hand out your customer details, your user ID, your password, because someone is sending you an email posing as the bank, let's say. You go to this website that looks like the bank, and you just provide that information. So now everyone can, the fraudsters can just access your account and empty it, right? And that's essentially the sort of problem that companies like Scioto were trying to solve. Now, the idea was that if this is happening, and I'm talking about 15 years ago, it will always come from a different device. It's not going to be from your own device that the attacker is going to approach from. So they will use their own device, not your device. And because of that, device recognition became all of a sudden a very interesting piece of technology. If you can say, hey, it's not coming from the trusted device, and obviously, money is going to a new destination and typically high amounts, that was enough to actually flag, red flag a lot of these transactions. You can also add things like the geolocation of where it's coming from and things like that. That was the basic technology. By the way, this startup was acquired by RSA in 2005, and the concept is known as risk-based authentication. Before risk-based authentication, if you had any kind of security problem on the bank side, you just elevated the authentication level to everyone. With risk-based authentication, you do it in a very, I would say, surgical way. You look at a specific transaction, you say, is it risky or not, based on a lot of features, a lot of parameters. If it's risky, okay, let's elevate the level of security for that specific transaction. Hey, it's coming from an untrusted device, as an example, an unknown geolocation, things like that. And now let's add some security in real time for that specific activity, which is surprising. I mean, you kind of think, hey, isn't this like obvious? No, it wasn't obvious because before the technology came to market, you just elevated security for everything.
Yeah, and it's easy to take stuff like this for granted today, right? You talk about sending email and password through a link that was clicked on, provided by like a bank email address. And most people, if not all, kind of know today to be a little wary of banks ever asking for your email and password because they've done such a good job of providing notices in all of their different communications that say, we'll never ask you for your email and password. So when you think about kind of the history of that, clearly that control was born out of some of these different scams that existed in the past. And it's interesting to hear you talk about risk-based authentication and kind of the early days from a financial crime standpoint, because that's such a core part of, again, like cloud services today, where you have Azure, for example, with Azure Active Directory, and you can apply risk-based authentication that provides additional controls or challenges when certain thresholds of risk have been crossed, again, like geolocation, for example, that you mentioned. So it's interesting to see these kind of parallels between how early financial crime identity protection controls have made their way into more modern just security tooling and environments in general.
Yep.
Okay, so one of the things that I want to touch on before we get back to identity is, to my knowledge, there's only really one stint outside of identity in your career, which was interim CEO at Funtactics, an internet games company, in early 2007. I think the position, you were only there for less than a year. What was the story? How did you end up getting involved with Funtactics?
Yeah, so it was, let's say, limited in time to begin with. I was an interim CEO. I was asked by one of the venture capital firms that invested in that company to take that position and help, the founders establish the principles of the business, right? It was all about developing online games to, like internet games. Back then, it was relatively nascent, kind of environment. And to begin with, it was set in time to, kind of help them out. I was like always drawn into the field of fighting financial crime. So at some point when RSA, called me back and said, "Hey, Yuri, we still need you. Let's reestablish the relationship." I was happy to go back after helping that company. The company was later acquired several years later by one of the major players in Israel in terms of like developing games. So hey, it was fun. It was it was a kind of an interesting thing to do. But going in, it was just helping out for a certain period of time before moving back to the real passion, which was the helping in the fight against financial crime.
The Israeli version of a sabbatical, where instead of taking 6 months to go on vacation, you just take 6 months to go lead a startup.
Yeah, and it was fun because, as an example, one of the training exercises was to move from level 0 to level 40 in World of Warcraft. That was part of the exercise drills that I had to do, when joining, just to understand the way the business is run and what sort of online games were active back then. So it was, as I said, it was lots of fun.
Right. So you moved back to RSA. What had already changed in the industry? Again, you'd only been gone working at Funtactics for, again, less than a year, 6 months or so, but you did talk already about how the industry has evolved over time. So from your initial experience in identity, that experience at Scioto, what had really evolved in the industry? Where was the industry focused on in your RSA time?
Yeah, so there was a very, very interesting change um, that was triggered by something that happened in the UK primarily. The UK market at that point, I'm talking about the banks, moved from typical pace of moving money into real-time money payment. It's called faster payments. That was in 2007 that the banks basically prepared for that. They added strong authentication, two-factor authentication. And in the UK, if you've ever been to the UK, you know that any access to the bank, any kind of transaction, you're always strongly authenticated. And then after the market moved to faster payment, fraud tripled. Although every bank used strong authentication, I'm talking about two-factor authentication, fraud tripled. This actually shows you one thing. You can think about authentication. You can even call it strong authentication, right? Like your proof of identity. Fraudsters don't care about that. And this was the big move from the phishing years into Trojans. And the notion that you can be you operating inside your account, and behind the scenes, there's going to be a Trojan that just empties your bank account automatically with some scripts. Or if there's some sort of two-factor authentication, it will trick you to actually provide the one-time code in real time. So now the criminal can then go ahead and use it with the bank. Again, using Trojans. So essentially that has been a period of several years where the industry really had to fight against a totally new problem called Trojans. Right. Trojans became very widespread, and these attacks, the Trojan attacks, you had Trojans that had millions of computers, infected, and most of it was financial related. These guys wanted your financial data.
So what was the kind of industry standard control in order to protect against Trojans at this time, after everyone realized, hey, Trojans are a growing issue for some of our different users and clients? What did the industry do in order to respond to that threat?
So there was a very interesting technology called Trustir, now owned by IBM, that was essentially almost baiting the Trojan to reveal itself. It was presenting some code that the Trojan responded to. And by looking at the way the Trojan responded to the code, it was possible to say, hey, this computer is under attack. This was a very helpful technology. And again, if you think about, if you kind of visualize fraud, it was increasing during the phishing years. There was 1 year where we saw a decrease, which was 2007, because everyone moved to strong authentication. 2008, fraud begins to grow again until it kind of triples because the UK moved to faster payment. I'm giving the UK as an example. And then there were a few years of relative calm as these new technologies, it's called anti-malware technologies, were essentially neutralizing a lot of the Trojans. So you might think, hey, with strong authentication, device recognition, geolocation analysis, and anti-malware, we're covered, right? Wrong. Far from it. 2015, it started to explode again. And I would say reaching again like very, very high levels of fraud. Reason was using remote access and social engineering, but we're making a little bit, moving a little bit ahead in time. I want to go back to 2011. I was at RSA, and not related at all to financial crime. There was one of the famous APTs where a foreign state invaded the RSA network. I can talk, for like hours about that. It was very, very interesting to be on the defense side. You're a security company, you're under attack. The good news is that you actually detect it, because back in 2011, folks like Mandiant, later acquired by FireEye, they had statistics, and only about, I think, 6% of companies became aware of the fact that they're under attack. Everyone else, they were under attack for months, sometimes years before discovering this, or someone else telling them, hey, you're under attack. So at least, RSA detected the fact that there is someone inside the network. They're like hanging around, they're moving around data, etc., etc. Unfortunately, it was too late. By the way, I was in Singapore when it happened, and my boss, she was running RSA Israel, calls me and say, hey, Yuri, something happened. I want to talk to you about it, but before I do, you need to sign on an NDA. And are you serious? And you want to tell me something? I have to sign an NDA. Yeah, it's a special NDA. Okay. So I signed on the NDA, and then she connected me to someone, from the headquarters in Bedford, Massachusetts, that basically explained about what they saw, and it was quite a lot, I would say. And that was when I learned about that attack, and that NDA expired a few months ago. But I think even like a few years after the attack, the NSA, the head of NSA, General Alexander, said, hey, it was China, right? And it was part of a very big sort of campaign. It wasn't the only company that was attacked. And I think people that know the history also, understand why RSA was attacked. It was part of a supply chain. RSA was not the final target of the attack. It was more to obtain, let's say, the RSA authentication capabilities in order to hit some other targets in the defense industrial base and other areas. In any case, it was very, very, very interesting. And if you like, we can do like another recording just to talk about what happened there. Because you're under attack. You're not allowed to talk to the market and explain exactly what's happening. There's a lot of like concerns and people asking questions, and you have to manage all of that. But I would say that my role back then was the head of new technologies. I was working with customers on one hand, and also understanding our technological capabilities, looking beyond RSA to see whether there are interesting things outside of RSA that we might be collaborating with or even acquiring. And a few months after that famous attack, I came across a new technology. They actually came to us, and we had a meeting at the RSA offices in Israel. The folks came from a company called BioCatch. That was a behavioral biometric technology. Behavioral biometric is fascinating. It's essentially looking at the way you move the mouse, the way you type information, the way you move between fields, the way you hold a mobile device and touch it and scroll and swipe. And the initial sort of offering was based on profiling the user, so understanding the way the user normally is operating, so then they can be authenticated. There was also a very interesting and clever trick that the team presented, which was to introduce small interruptions. So think about you moving the mouse and you want to click on a certain, like the submit button. And on route, the cursor veers off by an inch. Now, if it's a small sort of a deviation, you're not going to be aware of it. You're just going to be automatically correcting it. You have something in your brain called motor control. And the motor control function will just, kick off automatically, just adjust, right? And this is something that bots cannot do because they don't have like a brain and pair of eyes, etc. And also the way you're correcting is going to be different. It has to do with your own motor control function. So the notion was to look at the way you normally do it, the way you respond to these sort of small adjustments, and then build your profile. And if someone now is inside your bank account, let's say, or your enterprise account, it can be revealed because they don't have the same behavior. It was very, very interesting. I immediately fell in love and introduced those folks around. Everyone said, hey, if it's working as advertised, this is amazing, And at some point, they asked me to join as a co-founder to build a business. When I joined, it was a technology. It wasn't really clear whether this will be helpful for the enterprise market or the banks, right? Like, for example, the same sort of issues that I just described. And eventually, after talking to both sides of the market, it became apparent that banks are going to be the first ones to use the technology. They really were suffering from high fraud losses. You talked about identity. How do you prove user identity? And there was a big driver to use something beyond just device recognition and geolocation and these sort of things. that were not really stopping a lot of the fraud. So that was, the initial sort of understanding. So we started to aim the system towards using this in a banking environment. Let's say online banking specifically, online mobile banking specifically. But I will say, and we can go into it, that the product market fit was wrong because it was an authentication technology. The big notion was that, hey, instead of using passwords, let's say, how about we verify you based on your behavior? We can do it continuously, not at a certain point, like throughout the entire session. That was the kind of the initial notion, and this was the initial promise going to banks. And I can tell you that once you hit data, once you start seeing real world scenarios, like no plan survives contact with the enemy, same thing, right? It was different. And I can, if you're interested, I can explain what happened during the first sort of deployments that the technology had.
Yeah, definitely. You just touched on a lot there, to be sure. I mean, before we get there, I want to make sure that we just touch on kind of the problem that BioCatch was initially trying to solve, right? Because in the history that you outlined, you talked about the kind of user identity protection and detection. So making sure that when a user logs into an account, it's the legitimate account owner based on these different aspects like geolocation, for example. And then we have the kind of malware components of the Trojans that grew in popularity, and some of the different detection mechanisms that were built by the defense as well to detect that activity with the code tests. How is BioCatch and the technical capabilities that you described expanding on those technologies, and what's the specific problem that those previous technologies were unable to protect against that BioCatch was now able to resolve?
A great example would be remote access. And when we started to actually see real-world transactions, some of them looked weird. We saw that it's coming from the trusted device, but the mouse was moving in a very weird way, as an example. And we saw a lot of delays in the hand-eye coordination. It's almost like your responses were slowed down, right? If you think about what remote access is, if you had ever had this situation where a help desk is assisting you, and they take over your computer and you see them moving the mouse and opening applications, etc., it's a little bit sluggish, right? You have some delays that are related to just the internet, right? So this is actually impacting the hand-eye coordination, the interaction, let's say, level data. And we saw all sorts of odd things. When we asked the banks around it, they said, guys, you're onto something. You're actually witnessing something called remote access. Initially, most of those attacks were Trojan related, meaning that the user's computer was infected with a Trojan. The most famous ones back then were Dyer, Dridex, TrickBot, all of these Trojan families that have remote access functionality. The specific name for it was VNC Back Connect. And the point is that the criminals realized that if they actually use the malware in a normal way, it can be detected by the anti-malware technology. But how about making the malware silent? So you're infecting a computer, and you're not using the malware to actually manipulate the session. Instead, you're using the payload to set up remote access. Now you have remote access onto that computer, and you can go from that trusted device to the bank, right? And of course, you also need to collect information from the user. Could be username and password, could be, which is easy using a Trojan. You're not doing anything dynamic, you just collect information. But the point is that you can now access from the user device and do whatever you want using that Trojan functionality. So things like TrickBot and Dyer and Dridex, that's essentially what these technologies were doing. Another option for a criminal, let me actually share an interesting story. That was a little bit later, I think like 2016, something like that. We were working with, BioCatch was working with one of the banks in the UK. It's a private bank. And we alerted about a specific transaction. And therefore, the fraud team called that user. this was wealth management, private banking. And the user said, yeah, I know, you called me an hour ago. I spent like an hour on the phone with you guys. You told me that I have some sort of problem. And I told you, hey, I don't understand anything about computers because I'm 80 years old, and can you help me understand what's going on? And you said, no problem, sir. I mean, we're going to help you install something that allows us remote assistance, and then we can run some tests on your computer. Is that okay? And the user says, well, I don't really know anything about what you guys are saying. And you said, don't worry, sir. Do you know Google? Yeah, I know Google. All right, go to Google and look for TeamViewer, right? It's a software. And then please go and download that software, install that software, and configure it. We're going to help you configure it and all that. So after 30 minutes, it was very grueling for me. Now you managed to see my computer. And then you told me, hey, please log into your online banking account. And I did. And then you told me, hey, sir, you've been fantastic. We're going to run some tests and see what's wrong with your computer. And then I did something else. And you told me that you're going to call me. But hey, you don't know about the first people that called me. So I don't understand what's going on. That was obviously social engineering to trick an elderly person to install commercially available remote access. So, the fact was that I gave an example of a tool called remote access. It could be Trojan related. It could be that you trick the user to put it on their laptop or PC or even mobile device like iOS, Android, and game over, because now you're connecting from the user device, etc. And the way to observe it, you won't be able to observe it with geolocation because it's the real device. No device recognition is going to work. The anti-malware is not going to detect it because you're not doing anything active. You're just using remote access functionality. So the only thing that was actually detecting it was this behavioral biometric capability, right? So this is why banks started to use the behavioral biometric function.
Yeah, that's perfect context. That's exactly what I was trying to understand there. Like you said, it's kind of the evolution on the attacker's side, but then the evolution on the defense as well, to be able to compare even just legitimate human or illegitimate human activity to legitimate human activity. So I want to take you back now to what you were talking about with the product market fit component. And it sounded like you were describing a solution that was maybe more grand than the market was ready for at that point, where completely replacing passwords and just using authentication based on this kind of session activity or user habits. What were some of the challenges that the team ran into there?
So I would say that once we started to see the data, we found that everything that was done in the lab is great. Real world scenarios are different. I'm going to give you three scenarios that you cannot simulate in the lab. The first one is, hey, I've built a profile of the user on a PC, but now I see the first mobile transaction, right? You're coming from your iPhone for the first time. There's nothing that I can do to actually say, hey, it's the same person, right? Very, very different sort of interactions, obviously, on your iPhone versus your PC, okay? That's like a very easy example. Another one, there are several of those, right? So another one would be, it's not you, but it's not fraud. It's actually your wife or spouse or partner or someone else that is authorized, right? You authorize them to actually access your account because you're sharing passwords, let's say, with the same account. For every criminal that the system is going to flag, you're actually flagging 50, husbands of the real user, right? Or 50 wives of the real user. This means that the false positive level is going to be tremendous, okay? Now let's take other examples, which is, it is you, right? You're really Kyle. See the way you move the mouse, etc., but it's fraud. I just gave the example of this person that was asked to log in. And the login was perfect because it was done by the real person. Later on, the session is hijacked by remote access. We can see that, right? But the login was perfect. So you can even say, hey, everything is fine. We see the mouse is okay. We see the user responds normally. But then the session is being hijacked later on. So or cases of social engineering or cases of malware or all sorts of things where it is the real person, but there's going to be fraud. This actually means, again, that there are like two different questions here, the question of authentication and the question of fraud, okay? Fraud means this should not be happening. essentially.
Right.
And the realization is that in financial crime, that's the important question, okay? So, establishing identity is great, but the real question is, do we want to proceed with this transaction, right? Or we're going to regret it later on. So it's a fraud-related question. It's not an identity-related question. Now, the good news was that after the system, I explained the challenges, but the good news was that after the system went live, in order to prove that the system is working as advertised, the banks actually shared a fraud file. So now we know these specific transactions were fraudulent. All of a sudden, there was a totally new data set that we didn't have before, right? Because before we were working in the lab and doing profiling. We now understand the way the criminals operate. We understand bots. We understand remote access. We understand criminal behaviors. For example, criminals will have shortcuts that most people don't even know about, okay? Like, for example, someone was opening an account and using Shift Tab. Now, if you are, like a very savvy person, you might know that Shift Tab can take you back in the form, so you can correct some information. It's very efficient when you actually typing fast. Use tabs to move forward, and then Shift Tab if you wanted to correct something. How many good users use Shift Tab? By the way, the answer is about 0.2%. Okay, wow. So that's an example, and you cannot see that in a lab when you do an authentication technology, right, or profiling. You can see that if you track the fraudsters. Now, once the system had these two data sets, what we know about the user, what we know about the fraudster, it was 20 to 45 times more effective. It was dramatic, wow, right, in detecting fraud. And that was the big breakthrough, because once we had that, we showed the banks that we can very, very, very accurately help them fight the fraud. That was the initial, that was the actual thing that they were interested at, fighting the fraud. Now, this is all related to account takeover fraud. I can tell you that another issue with all of this is, what happens if it's a new user, right? You haven't seen the user before. For example, account opening. Someone is opening an account online, right, with a credit card account or bank account. And nowadays, it's so easy to open an account on Kyle McNulty's behalf, right? Because your data was stolen 50 times, right? So a lot, and I'm talking about not just your username, passwords, and stuff like that, all of your financial records and credit history and whatever, because the fraudsters hacked into all of the major, data players, and credit bureaus, and all that. So they have everything that they need to open accounts on behalf of someone else. But when you open an account, there's no prior history. So the entire notion of using behavioral biometrics should not work, because it's supposed to be like profiling you and seeing, hey, someone else is inside the account. In a new account situation, the only thing that works is the genuine population versus the fraudster population. It's very simple to explain that, because if you are opening an account and you're a real person, you will be very familiar with your own personal information, your name, your social security number, these sort of things. You're not going to be familiar with the process of account opening because you do it for the first time. Criminals are the opposite. They're very familiar with the process. They're not familiar with the data. So there's a huge difference between good people and bad people as they do account opening. And this is how the system evolved from account takeover situations into account opening situations, and later on also social engineering, which is another fascinating twist in the whole sort of story of financial crime. Again, we're moving a little bit ahead in time. This is more or less like from 5 years ago, where it started in the UK. Fraudsters basically said the banks are doing so much that we will do something completely different. And this is known as authorized push payments, or I call it deep social engineering. Very, very different from what we described so far. And the system had to be reinvented in order to solve for that. So we can talk about that if that's interesting.
Yeah, one thing that I want to touch on there is how BioCatch operated across some of the data pools from its different customers. So, for example, if Kyle McNulty previously had Bank of America accounts that BioCatch was helping to monitor with some of those biometrics, And then Kyle McNulty went to open a new Chase account, which was also, again, a BioCatch customer. Was BioCatch able to say, okay, these same kind of tendencies that Kyle had on Bank of America are going to apply to Chase in terms of how he moves a mouse, how he scrolls, etc. And were you able to kind of aggregate that data set across those customers, or were there logistical challenges with that?
Yeah, so it's actually okay to collect this information. There are a number of new regulations, relatively new regulations like GDPR in Europe,
Right.
CCPA in California, etc. But all of these regulations basically say it's okay to collect this information as long as this is for financial crime prevention, right? Or crime prevention, let's say. So it is okay to collect this information. In terms of like data sharing, of course, it's up to the bank. Some banks, like the idea of fighting this together. Some banks don't like the idea of fighting this together. So it's not that you have like a free reign into using the data however you see fit. But if banks are collaborating, you're right. A lot can be done. I cannot go into specifics here, but the notion that you can really fight this together. Obviously, you can track bad people, fraudsters, and the way they actually behave, and almost like the signature, digital signature of criminals. I think that's obvious, right? You can then put it in a centralized database and almost like say, okay, we know that this is the behavior of a specific bad person. And it's done not just in financial crime, it's done in cybersecurity, all sorts of indicators of attack or indicators of behavior, etc. And you can extend that to other areas as well. So you're right. I cannot really go into specifics into how exactly it's done. Yeah.
Okay. And then the other piece that I was curious about is just tying together a security analogy. Would BioCatch be more analogous to an IDS or an IPS? So is it just one more sensor that informs a kind of grander prevention or protection decision? Or is BioCatch kind of autonomous in denying some of these different account transactions?
So a lot of the banks actually use this as the main line of defense these days. The behavioral biometric technology is so powerful, and the signal is so strong that you can really make a lot of decisions, fraud-related decisions, based on that. So take into account a big credit card company in the US. A lot of the credit card companies today in the US are using the technology, or banks in, like retail banks in the US, in the UK, in Canada, etc. In many cases, they will use this as the way to make decisions. Of course, there are additional technologies like device recognition that we talked about and geolocation, but you can't really compare them. The accuracy level of behavioral biometrics is so fantastic. Over the years, a lot of the banks started to use the technology. Some of the banks actually invested in the BioCatch. So this is public knowledge that Citi and HSBC, American Express, Barclays, and National Australia Bank, they decided to invest in the company, and then also challenge the BioCatch team with additional things that are happening that the behavioral biometric technology can help with. So essentially, that's the way things kind of progressed.
Wow. So with all this progress with BioCatch over the last almost decade or so now, again, becoming one of the leaders in a category that's kind of defining identity protection and fraud detection within the financial crime sector, you're also now kind of looking at some new avenues. You're currently working on a new stealth project that's tying back into this whole financial crime industry. What's really next for you just in this whole sector?
Before I answer that, Kyle, I do want to go back to one thing that we kind of skipped, if that's okay with you, which is deep social engineering. I want to explain this point because it's very interesting. BioCatch is using machine learning, right? And let's say an AI engine that looks at hundreds and thousands of features and trying to say whether this is going to be a fraud case or not a fraud case. This looks at your, historic behavior. This looks at historic criminal behaviors. It looks at tools that the criminals are using, etc., etc. But a few years ago, one of the banks in the UK came to us with a very interesting sort of problem. someone got a phone call from her mobile provider. Hey, you're late on your fees. Can you please pay? And she pays. And then she gets a call from the bank. Can you explain what this is? Yeah, it's my mobile provider. I paid my fees. No, it's not. You paid someone, but that was actually a fraudster. And you gave them your debit card and it's linked to your bank account. So unfortunately, we'll have to move you to a new bank account. Can you please log in online? We'll give you your new bank account number. And can you please move all of your money to this new bank account number? Now, Kyle, you're probably grinning and saying, hey, there's no way she fell for that. but she did. And basically, she went into her account. She logged in. She was then told, hey, there's a problem. We wanted you to move all of your money, but you have like too much money inside your checking account. Can you please start by moving 9,000 pounds, British pounds? We're going to check that it's in your safe, bank account. And then we'll ask you to move more money. Is that okay? And then she says, yeah, let's do it right now. So she actually logged in and then started to move money in big chunks and waited until confirmation from the bank that it's now in her new and safe bank account. Of course, it was never the bank. It was just another person from the same crime ring. And this is known as authorized push payment. Why it's called authorized? Because this is the real person. And obviously, it will come from a trusted device, the trusted geolocation. Behavioral biometrics is going to say, hey, it's the real person. There's no fraud, meaning that it's not a criminal. They're not using remote access or bots or anything, or like criminal behavior. It's the real person moving money from the account. It's almost like you had the AI look at it and faint dead away, right? Because nothing, right, could detect it. And if you actually think about it, are banks supposed to detect something like this? If you actually go to your online banking and move money to a stranger, and it's you doing it, it's not like a criminal, right? Are you supposed to, like as a bank, are you supposed to, refund the user if something like this happens?
Right.
This is a very interesting question. The banks were at that point like interested in this, but it wasn't like a very big issue until a very big consumer group in the UK filed a complaint. Actually, it was a super complaint. It was like a very big sort of complaint to the regulator that said, hey, the banks know more about this than the users. A lot of it is like elderly people. The banks have to do something around it. When the regulator started to talk to the banks said, hey, guys, can you do something around it? And initially, the answer was, how can we do something around it? It's like, it's the real person doing it, right? So behavioral biometrics is supposed to say everything is fine. It's not a criminal, no remote access, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom line was it was impossible to detect until the data science team started to look at it. So again, the score that the automatic system was providing was everything is fine. But then when you actually started to look at the data, interesting things emerged. For example, the user, after moving the money, spent like 5 minutes randomly doodling with the mouse on the screen. They're just randomly moving the mouse on the screen. You don't often see something like this in online banking because it's online banking. It's not an entertainment system, right? Why is the user moving the mouse for 5 minutes? She was told to wait. She didn't want to go out of the computer, and she was heavily distracted. And this is the way her brain basically, governed that specific period of time. She was just entertaining herself with, moving the mouse. That was proof that the user is distracted. She was more hesitant. When you click to submit, you click, let's say on your mouse, you click and then you release the finger. 120 milliseconds is the average. If you are under duress or guidance or something like this, it might be 300 milliseconds. Signs of being guided. You're listening to the instructions. Someone is reading instructions over the phone, so your phone is close to your ear, but you're not really type. So you listen to some instructions and then you move the device so you can type on the phone. The device will move as you move money to a new destination, right? Because someone is reading to you your new bank account, which you don't know, right? So in the middle of a transaction, when you actually send money to a specific new destination, the device moves, right? Again, you're basically looking at very, very subtle behaviors. Let's call the micro behaviors. Once the data science team at BioCatch started to see all of that, they created more of these micro behavior analysis points, aggregated it into a machine learning model, and all of a sudden you have a new AI that can now detect something like this. But I would say that the AI needed some help, right? And before a new AI was able to be established and work on this. So and now it's like a new sort of let's say model that the BioCatch has. A lot of the banks in Europe are now using this for this specific issue. Now you asked about the next thing for me personally. So yeah, I mean something happened to me personally, which was very interesting. I'm always going to RSA conference to talk in in San Francisco in RSA the RSA conference. And a few years ago, I think 2014, I did a demo about Bitcoin security. For that, I actually purchased 2 Bitcoins. I think back then the Bitcoin was a few $100s. So I bought a few Bitcoins. Last year, I decided to sell one of the Bitcoins, and the bank didn't accept the money. So I get a call from my branch. Hey, Yuri, there's a problem. Compliance are not going to be allowing us to keep that money. It has to go back to the exchange. I said, are you serious? Yeah, that's the compliance. Okay, can I talk to compliance? No one can talk to compliance. That was the response. They connected me to the branch manager. She said, hey, Yuri, I'm sorry. It is what it is. Maybe you have another bank. You can try to move money to the other bank account. I said, maybe I move all of my money to this other bank. I mean, what's the response to this, right? It was infuriating. And around the same time, I realized that the whole issue of money laundering, the way you're actually, the way banks are doing, financial crime compliance is like very outdated. The systems produce a high degree of false positives. The banks hire armies of people. The big banks, even like thousands of people to go through these alerts. All of this is a very, time-consuming investigation. They have to go via the branch or the call center to collect information from users. It's never real time. So the point is that the number of people that are actually just looking at alerts increases all the time. There's new regulation all the time. There's new genuine activities all the time, like users doing cryptocurrencies and sending money to Robinhood, etc., etc. That those systems cannot cope with. And this actually, started to move some wheels in my brain. And I started thinking in terms of, is there anything that can be done around all of this? Like you said, it's a stealth mode company that is developing a new technology around all of this. But I think it's a very, very important piece of the equation, because fighting financial crime, you have to move to a much more, I would say, advanced, set of capabilities. So that's essentially where I'm focused on these days.
Interesting. Well, you've certainly made so much progress throughout this entire history of fraud detection. I'll certainly be following along to see how that progresses in the money laundering space. Well, again, thank you so much for your time, Yuri. I know, again, because it's in stealth, we won't dive into anything further there. Listeners will just have to stay tuned for how that comes together and when that announcement comes out. But certainly wish you all the best moving forward.
Thanks, Kyle. Hope it was interesting for everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can write to me at kyle@secureventures.io. I'm Kyle McNulty, and you've been listening to Secure Ventures.